Hello, class. Today we're going to cover the lesson 1 of the circulatory system. To introduce circulatory system, we talk about the first organ to form and the last organ to die. That would be the heart. From the time that your heart was 2.5 millimeters in size and 3.5-week-old embryo, the human heart already had a heartbeat. So, what are the main functions of the circulatory system? Well, it circulates the oxygen and nutrients to the cells. So, the nutrients that came from the digestive system, they are too large to enter the cell, so they need to be simplified into very small, simple particles that can enter the cell, and this is done through the circulatory system. The oxygen that came from the lungs through the respiratory system is now being circulated into the cells through the circulatory system. So the good things that go in, well, the bad things need to get out as well. So the circulatory system also removes the waste products of the cellular processes. So the types of circulatory system in animals are, there are two kinds, open and closed. So the open circulatory system, the blood or the fluid are not enclosed within vessels. So there are no pipes that run throughout the organism. So these are very simple types of animals. So they must be very small that they can diffuse the materials in and out of the cell. The closed circulatory system, this kind of circulatory system would occur in more complex, larger animals, and the blood or fluids are enclosed within the blood vessels because they are at least 2 cell thick. They're too large to circulate the materials in and out of the cell. So one of the questions here, it says, why do you think cardiovascular related deaths are so high in Canada, as well as the US, I guess in North America? You could take a look at the diet, the lifestyle, how much activity we have, and always the genetics will always play a role in maintaining homeostasis and what kind of diseases we will or we can develop. So it's a combination of these three things that will essentially dictate whether or not we are maintaining homeostasis or not. So in this lesson, as always, we're going to look at the anatomy and physiology. So when you're studying the human body, you take a look at the structure, which is the anatomy. So we have to learn the parts, the structures of the circulatory system, and what these parts do. So that will be the physiology. And we're going to be looking at a diagram later. So the circulatory system is also known as the cardiovascular system, which consists of the heart, which is the pump, a closed system of vessels known as the arteries, arterioles, veins, venules, and capillaries. So the three main parts of the blood vessels really are arteries, veins, and capillaries. So you could make an analogy at this point. The circulatory system, also known as the cardiovascular system, is very much like a circuit. So looking at a circuit has three parts. So you have this is an electric circuit. So the three parts are, you have a pump or the power source. So if this is an electric circuit, we talk about the power source being AC or DC, the outlet, or a battery. Then you gotta get the power into whatever device you're powering, which will then be the path or the wires in an electric circuit. Then eventually you need to power up a device called a resistor or the load. So if you take a look at the circulatory system, it really is just like a circuit. You have a power source. In this case, the pump will be the heart, and then you have the path, which would be the vessels, the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries, and the load are the cells. And of course, what runs within the vessels are the blood carried by the blood vessels. So the circulatory system performs a number of important functions in the human body. So let's take a look at these parts of the functions. I'm going to say I'm going to summarize this into 6 functions. Of course, we already know that the circulatory system carries nutrients to the cells, and of course, it removes the waste products from the cells, which are toxic. The circulatory system carries the hormones to target cells or to target tissue. Circulatory system is also important for heat regulation, and this is why we have the ability to maintain our temperature. We are called warm-blooded because of the type of circulatory system that we have. It also maintains body fluid. So body fluid regulation. And lastly, but not least, is our immunity. Now, this time we have a pandemic, as you already know, the coronavirus. And as with any viruses, especially when there is no vaccine or antivirals that are effective yet, we rely on our immunity to fight these viruses. So that is one of the important functions of the circulatory system. Okay, so let's talk about the blood vessels. Blood vessels are the channels through which the blood is distributed to the body tissues, to the cells. So the two systems are blood vessels in the human body are the pulmonary system, also known as the pulmonic system, and this is the system that circulates the blood between the heart and the lungs. So I'm just going to use the arrows here, meaning the heart. The blood goes from the heart to the lungs, and the blood goes from the lungs and back to the heart. And the other system of blood vessels is called systemic. The systemic system is between the heart and the rest of the body cells, and of course the body cells has to return the blood back to the heart, and that would be the systemic system. Okay, what about the types of blood vessels? So arteries, so there are three kinds of blood vessels, three main types of blood vessel. Just to summarize that right here, we have the artery, that, and then we have the capillaries. I'm going to put capillaries here in between, and then we have the vein. And I put capillary between the artery and the vein because it is the capillary that connects the artery with the vein. So what are the characteristics of arteries? These types of blood vessels contain high pressure. So the blood within the arteries have higher blood pressure than the other ones, and this results in a pulse. Because of this characteristic of the artery, they have to have thick walls and very strong three tissue layers in order for them to be able to sustain that high pressure within these types of vessels. And of course, the aorta is the largest artery in the human body. It's about 25 millimeters in diameter. That's about an inch. It's the largest in the human body. Whereas arterioles are the smallest one. They're only 0.2 millimeters. So it's like the width of a human hair. So this is a picture of the artery. It has the three layers. Tunica intima is the inner, tunica media is the middle part, and the tunica externa would be the external layer of the artery. Now we look at capillaries. Capillaries, mentioned earlier, connects the arteries and the veins. They are very, very small. In fact, it is a very small kind of blood vessel that is only one cell thick. Because of this being so thin, well, it doesn't have any pressure at all, so it doesn't have to be thick. So one cell thick allows diffusion of particles. So this is where the gases are diffused, oxygen going into the cells and the cells returning the gas, the carbon dioxide, back into the heart to be pumped into the lungs. Very, very small, very thin. So we have about 100,000 kilometers of capillaries in our body. They're so numerous. Now we look at veins. So veins, they carry, oh, I forgot. I should actually mention here that arteries, which is the most important characteristic, is that they carry oxygen blood, except the pulmonary artery. So we need to make sure that we know that, because the pulmonary artery actually carries the deoxygenated blood from the heart into the lungs. And that is why it needs to go to the lungs to pick up the oxygen. So veins carry blood that contains the carbon dioxide or the deoxygenated DO2 blood from the cells back to the heart. And veins are a little bit thinner than the arteries, so there is lower pressure within the walls of the veins, so they don't need to be as thick and strong as the arteries. Because of this, there is no pulse in the veins. Because of the lower pressure, they need to have a characteristic that prevents the backflow of the blood. So they do have valves. So that's an important characteristic of the veins. One more thing I need to mention here, it carries the oxygenated blood from the cell, so it contains the blood that is not going to do good for the cells. So again, except the pulmonary veins. So how do veins function in moving the blood despite the blood pressure being low? We talk about this because of the valves. Okay, so veins, like any other blood vessels, are subject to problems. Why is that? Why is it subject to problems? Well, because of the lower blood pressure, um, there could be the possibility of blood pooling in these veins, and that results in varicose veins. So varicose veins are when the blood is pools within the veins, causing bulging of these veins due to restricted movement. So our lifestyle, or if we are not moving as much, we can develop the varicose veins, which usually appears, you'd see it on the back of your knees. Now we talk about the most important part of the circulatory system, the star of the show, the heart. So the layers of the heart, we are going to look at the anatomy. I'll be posting some videos about that by itself with the anatomy of the heart. It has very muscular layers, the strongest muscle. If you think about it, the heart has to be, the cardiac muscles need to be very strong, the strongest muscle indeed. It doesn't take a break. If the heart ever takes a break or stops beating, that would be pronouncing the person dead. So if you take your fist, your dominant hand, that would be the size of your large fist and has an approximate mass of 300 grams, so a little over 1 cup of water. Beats about 70 times and about 5 liters of blood every minute. So 7,000 liters of blood every day. So the layers of the muscles of the heart are called you have the myocardium, the pericardium. So the pericardium would be this is the outer layer of the heart, and it is filled with fluid called it's a pericardium, which is essentially the skin of the heart. Why is the pericardium filled with fluid? Well, your heart is beating all the time, so the pressure is quite high. So every time it beats, the size changes. So it gets bigger, it gets smaller, and there's a lot of pressure that are being imposed on the wall of the heart. So the fluid bathes the heart, preventing friction between the outer wall and the membrane. The myocardium is the cardiac muscle itself. This would be the main muscle of the heart. And of course, the endocardium, I should add here at this point, the endocardium would be the inner layer of the heart that has cavities. Okay. Again, I will go over the anatomy of the heart in a separate lesson. So we'll talk about the septum, the atria, the left and the right atria, the ventricles, the left and the right ventricles, and the 4 valves involved. And we're also going to look at the circuits and how the blood flows inside the heart, which is a coronary, and the blood flow between the heart and the lungs, and between the heart and the rest of the body. So we will look at that separately. So looking at again the blood vessels, so these are the veins. The largest veins in the body are the vena cava. So you have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. The only difference between these two is that the superior vena cava returns the blood from the upper part of the body. So we'll just call it the upper body, whereas the inferior vena cava returns the blood from the lower body. Okay, and there's a picture of superior and inferior vena cava. I'm going to also cover the blood flow on a separate lesson. This can be pretty complicated, but I'm going to do a simplified diagram of the blood flow. So let's take a look at the valves. So this will be covered in more details. The AV valves, or the atrioventricular valves, there are two kinds. We have the tricuspid and the bicuspid. The mitral valve is known as the bicuspid as well. Tricuspid because it has three cusps. It actually looks like it has three cusps like that, 1, 2, 3 cusps. So whereas the mitral valve would only have two, also known as the semilunar valve. The tricuspid valve is the valve that separates the blood flow. So there's no backflow. So that's why the valves are important. Between the right atrium, I'm going to just simplify the right atrium as RA, and the right ventricle. This carries the oxygenated blood, or CO2 containing blood. The mitral valve is the valve that prevents the backflow between the left atrium and the left ventricle, which contains the oxygenated blood. Now we look at the two semilunar valves like this. The pulmonary valve is the valve that prevents the backflow between the right ventricle and the lungs. So it's a very efficient system. The flow of blood is one way in a healthy organism, so there should not be any backflow. If the valves have a malfunction, then the blood will be mixing oxygen and carbon dioxide, or deoxygenated blood, and the cells are not going to receive the oxygenated blood that they need. So there will be some problems there, and homeostasis will not be attained, and eventually the organism can be sick. The aortic valve is the valve that prevents the backflow between the left ventricle and the aorta. Okay, the systemic arteries and veins. Again, the systemic. So looking at systemic is between the heart and the body cells, the rest of the body, whereas the coronary circulation is within the heart itself. So the aorta can be divided into three portions. You have the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, and the descending aorta. So ascending is going up, and the aortic arch is an arch, the name implies, and the descending aorta is the aorta that carries the blood to the lower portions of the body. So here is a picture of all the circulation, the major blood vessel. Of course, there are more than that. It doesn't show the capillaries because they are very, very small. Coronary circulation, the function of the coronary circulation is to circulate the blood within and around the heart itself. So, the heart being the main pump of the blood that does the function of the circulatory system also needs to have supply of blood. So, the circulatory system has a separate circulation for the heart itself. This is what this coronary circulatory system is doing. If something goes wrong with the coronary circulation, this could lead in myocardial infarction, which is also known as a heart attack. Now, in a fetus meaning that this is before birth, when the fetus is still within the in the uterus, the fetus is not using its lungs, so the lungs are not functional. And again, that's the question of why does the baby cry? Why does the baby cry the moment it comes out of the uterus? Well, because of the pressure of the lungs inflating. The fetus does not have any use for the lungs because the fetus uses the placenta of the mother to do the gas exchange. So before birth, there is no air in the lungs itself. So when the baby is born and exits the uterus, the fetal circulation no longer needs to do what it does while inside the uterus. The lungs then will take over and the fetus will have to breathe on its own. So the pressure actually causes some, I guess, some sensation, and the fetus cries at birth. So how does the fetus then do gas exchange within the uterus? There are two very special device or system that allows the fetus to exchange the nutrients and the oxygen and remove the waste back to the mother. There are two within the placenta. Okay, so the placenta of the mother is doing the gas exchange as well as in nutrients. There are two special device or special shunts that allow the fetus to be able to do this circulation. So we call it the foramen ovale and the ductus arteriosus. So again, I'm going to be covering this in a separate lesson when we talk about circulation. So the two system or the two special openings that allow the fetus to be able to do the circulation is made possible by the foramen ovale into the left atrium. So essentially, let me make a small simplified diagram here. So if this is the heart, I'm making it very simple here. Once the baby is born, you actually have 4 different chambers. So this is the right atrium, and this is the right ventricle. This is the left atrium and the left ventricle. Because the lungs are non-functional, there is a shunt that directs the blood directly from the right atrium and into the left atrium, bypassing the lungs completely. This is the job of the foramen ovale. So this carries oxygenated blood from the right atrium without going into the lungs and into the left atrium so that the blood can be pumped into the cells of the fetus. The other shunt that allows circulation in a fetus is called the ductus arteriosus that leads to the aorta. So you have the blood coming from the right atrium, leads to the right ventricle. Now, normally this goes through the pulmonary artery and into the lungs, but because the lungs are non-functional, the blood of the fetus goes straight from the right ventricle into the aorta and again into the circulation of the fetus. When the fetus is born, the fetal circulation stops right away, and the holes are supposed to close right at birth or shortly after birth. In some cases, these holes do not close up during birth, and the foramen ovale and the ductus arteriosus cause a mixing of the oxygenated and the deoxygenated blood, causing what we call the as blue baby. Now, the reason we call it blue baby is that the foramen ovale and the foramen ovale does not close or fails to close right away, and there is mixing of the oxygen and deoxygenated blood, causing the baby to turn blue, especially around the mouth and the extremities, hence the name blue baby. And that is the end of lesson 1, and I'm going to assign the questions at the end of the lesson 1. So please try these questions, and if you can take a picture and send it to me by email for assessment. Yeah.
Okay. I tried to take